Maestro Donato, are very honored to have you all join us this afternoon for a conversation with Professor Edgar Rivera-Colon. Just a brief synopsis of why we're here. The Theater of the Beloved Community, a brainchild of Don's thesis, is now evolving into many different things. Everything from performances regularly that honor our stories, all community stories, right, and really connect to dates, specific moments in time, to moments like this, conversations to really hone in on topics that matter to the community, that matter to all of us. And so thank you so much, Professor Colon, for taking the time to speak to us. I'll throw it over to Don to introduce Professor Colon. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Welcome. And thank you, Dr. Rivera-Colon. We're so honored and blessed to have you here. Now, I invited Dr. Rivera-Colon here to lecture on his own style of pedagogy, which has roots in Ignatian spirituality as well as popular education. And I thought that it would be very useful and important to somehow bring that to the public, not simply in a class that he would teach at the university. Because there's no untruth in saying that his pedagogy and his style of lecturing, something that might be, the concept of lecturing might be boring to many students, but his always engages. It always inspires. It never fails to. And so with everything that's happening in our world now, and the hegemony that continues to keep the destitute in their low suffering places, and to keep the rich powerful, to see that we're not doing anything to prevent or at least impede the impending crises, that I would turn it over to Dr. Rivera-Colon to describe what exactly he does to mobilize his students. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle and Dominic, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. It's good to see new and not so new faces. My comrade of many years, Anna Brown, who I met when I was an undergraduate at Fordham, all those years ago, in another brutal regime that wasn't that we thought was the worst it could get, right?
Right.
The Reagan Bush years.
Exactly.
So much for our analysis.
Right.
And it's good to see Mrs. Mastodonado here, and of course Father Terrence Moran, and of course Professor Pruk, who's now a colleague at SPU. So I guess where to begin would be the question. And I think that we're having this conversation amongst comrades and co-conspirators in a few days away from the national elections, right? And I think we should be like sober in terms of what we'll be confronting, whatever the results are, right? And I mean, like, as many of you know, I'm a Marxist, Christian Marxist, but a Marxist, and that it's always been clear to me, you know, from the tradition I'm from, in terms of political analysis, that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, doesn't solve problems through electoral means. They present options, right, that are about tactical differences, right? And, you know, we, as predicted by earlier writings of Marxists in the 20s and 30s and 40s, including people like Simone Weil, right, that the market and its logic cannibalizes all of civil society, what we call civil society, right? And even the idea that we have civil society, right, is an artifact of ideology itself, right? So what we're seeing today, in just a few days from the election, is a realignment amongst the elites and an attempt by different sectors of the elites, right, who correspond to different fractions of, you know, sort of the economy, to create a coalition that will lead them into state power, right? We get a sense of what the Trump coalition is. We're getting a sense of what the Biden-Harris coalition is. But remember, this is about elites acting in agency and people following them through electoral means, right? So I think we can start thinking about very fundamental things now, right? So what are the actual options being offered right now? One is Christian fascism. I mean, I think that's the best way to describe it. Now, it's not the Christian fascism of Franco. It's a Christian fascism that its base is white evangelicals, right? And the elites around there, and that's Trump, sort of populism. And the other is a corporate neoliberal, diversity forward, in a very narrow sense of the word, a dispensation that I would call, democratic centrism with right tendencies, right? So that's the layout, right? Now, the reality is that a lot of people in this country, if they're going to vote Democrat or whatever, they feel the Democratic Party is the least whatever, right? It's the least harmful of the solutions. But again, we don't have as articulate a tradition of third parties and communist parties and socialist parties as they are in Europe or in Latin America, for example. So before all that, what should we say? First of all, I'm going to make a prediction, and you guys can text me on Wednesday or Thursday. Say you're wrong.
Can we put money on it now? Should we take
yeah, no problem. You know me, I'm from Jersey. Right. So I think I would say at this point, I put this in my social media, the Democrats will win. They will win big, and the Senate will flip. And I don't pay attention to the national polls because we don't have a national election. I've been looking at the swing states carefully. So my statistical analysis, purely on the math, nothing else, is that they win. And the crisis deepens, right? Because the militias, the Trump militias will act out. Sectors of the policing establishment, sheriffs, cops, are aligned with Trump. And I know this not as theoretically. I mean, I have a nephew of mine who's a state trooper, who's Puerto Rican. He says to me all the time, I told him not to become a state trooper, but he says to me all the time, Tio, these people are fascists. These white guys they're fascist. I mean, and he's not a politically sophisticated kid, but he says, no, those people are not about us, right? So we're going to have a contention process. There's going to be two forms of sort of contention. One will be the usual nonsense from like Republican lawyers and the election has been stolen, right? And the difference here is the conjuncture, right? There's a certain certainty, right, that the Republicans have because they went the sort of right-wing populist extreme way and won. So they're not going to do what Al Gore did. Al Gore in 2000 missed an opportunity to do a civil rights claim and to really challenge Bush. They're going to do that. They're going to challenge people on it. And then there's going to be the independent action of armed militias, right? So I think we're going to be in for a process of a long time before state power transfers. So under the quote unquote best scenario, there are going to be problems, right? So these are the historical moments we're living in, right? And I want to sort of talk to you a little bit about the idea of a conjuncture, right? In Latin America, they use the idea of coyuntura actual, which is, are we able to look at the forces at play and do a conjunctural analysis of what's happening? And in terms of like spirituality or religion, we need to do spiritual conjunctures, spiritual political conjunctures, right? Like what are actually the forces at play? Where are the forces of freedom? Where are the forces of unfreedom? How are they organized and how are they confronting themselves and manifesting themselves in institutions and in mass movements, right? All that stuff, right? And for those of you who want a 101 lesson on how to do conjunctural analysis from the 19th century, read Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, because it's really an essay that says, this in 1848, we had this change, we got rid of this guy and we were pushing for Republican values in the French tradition. And then we got this guy who became an emperor. Oh yeah, sure. So the text by Marx is the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. And it's his reflections on sort of how did a second empire emerge in France, and what were the class alignments that led to it. Okay, so that's just a way as a preamble. Secondly, pedagogy. This is a time when pedagogy is important, and I'm gonna just be blunt with people. I didn't really learn to be a pedagogue or to do pedagogy in the classroom. I learned it doing work in the community around HIV/AIDS. And I became a teacher, with all my limits, right? With activists and frontline workers who taught me how to teach, right? And who taught me that whatever material you bring as content to a class, there's an intellectual piece of like what's being said, but there's also an emotional and social piece that has to be connected. And generally with undergraduates, many of you, teach undergraduates or will teach undergraduates, it's usually about connecting with them, allowing them to appropriate the information emotionally and socially, to bring the intellectual content into the realm of affect. Because why affect? Why affect? Because our affective lives are sort of, in one sense, part of our felt thoughts, or if you will, the emotional history of our encounter with the world, right? And that's why, for example, today, a lot of young people talk about trauma. Because what they're saying by trauma is saying, this is the history we come from, this is how we feel it affectively, right? And this is how we're going to confront it through our healing practices, through talking about it. So it's not a coincidence that like the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, it begins with people who are what? Gender and racial oppressed and class oppressed, right? People who've had this sort of experience of trauma. Think about the book by Patrisse Cullors, When They Call You a Terrorist. It's a brilliant memoir, right? But it's like Patrisse just lays out, this whole theory about like, you have to attend to this piece about the emotional, the affective, the spiritual side, because that's really how they hoist people up. They get them to feel like shit, right? And that's part of the social control mechanism. So for me as a pedagogue, what I learned in HIV/AIDS work was that if the work was not grounded in a politics of love, open to creative expression, right? And interested in spirit, however you want to define that the work wasn't solid, right? That eventually people get alienated and start feeling like they're numbers, like people who are in their learning communities don't care, right? And they just go through the regular phone at home. So what I did with my students, my undergraduates, with my Columbia students is a little different. I got to convince them that they can do their work and they're fine without too much of my interference. But with my undergraduates at St. Peter's specifically, it was important for me to get them to make these connections between what was being provided in terms of content and their lived experience. Like in the urban studies classes, it was really all about gentrification. Really, what were we teaching? We're teaching about gentrification, like the actual process that's occurring in Hudson County, right? And how people are being displaced. So for me, I think pedagogy is important in the sense that it allows you to create a learning instance where people can bring this emotional, affective, spiritual part to the learning process. And slowly you begin to see that you're facilitating more than you're really teaching. But there's also a piece where you do want that content piece to be there. Now, what's important about pedagogy now in this moment? I think what's important about pedagogy now is answering some very basic questions. One is, who are my people, right? Who are the people that claim me as theirs? And who are the people that I claim as mine, right? That's one way to begin, right? The other thing is, what is mine to do? What is mine to do? what is ours to do? And I'm really happy that Michelle and Dom have created this community group, because that's what it's yours to do, right? And the theater is as you guys well know, it's a full body experience, right? It's not this, you're reading from a text, and it engages audiences in a way that, live theater engages audiences in a way that a movie can't. It's just a different experience, and there's an ephemeral quality to it. The performance occurs, it's gone, right? And so there's a whole space for reflection. Now that the performance is over, what did I learn? What did I feel? That kind of stuff, right? So for me, I think that at this point, it's important for us to create communities of learning and to continue the communities of learning we have in order to have like what I call sacred and safe spaces for people to grow and develop. And I think that the other piece to think about in terms of this is an incredibly important moment to engage those questions, right? Who are my people? Who claims me? Who do I claim? What is ours to do? What is mine to do? And that's a matter of like collective and individual discernment. I think at the core of my teaching, in as much as it's effective, is discernment, right? Now Ignatius, I love Ignatius, right? But he was a bit of a nut, right? Because when you think about how he views mission, it's very like almost like one direction, right? Whereas I think in our context, it's really about entering a process of collective discernment, where at the center is we know that there are structures of unfreedom, but even in those spaces, there are tiny spaces of freedom. Now, how do we build those tiny spaces of freedom within those structures, but also how to create new forms or new structures that may allow us to be free or to be freer? For example, like JC Solidarity would be a perfect example of that. It's not that y'all are doing mutual aid, it's that y'all, which is great, right? It's that y'all are self-developing collectively as a result of the work of mutual aid. And there's something about being a collective, about doing group work that changes people. Anna can speak of her experiences, millions of Kairos, the People's Forum before the pandemic, right? And so I think there's an insight there. I don't know if you guys must know Sam Delaney. He was a gay science fiction writer, Black gay science fiction writer. He wrote a beautiful memoir called The Motion of Light and Water. And Sam, the subtitle is like Motion of Light and Water, Sex and Science Fiction in the East Village in the 1950s or something like that, right? So Sam talks about in the 60s being in the baths, the gay baths in St. Mark's Place. This is before the AIDS pandemic, and being amongst all these gay men and realize, oh, this is who we are. We've always been here. We've built institutions for us, right? And I think this is a moment where people, especially between the ages of 18 and 40, are beginning to construct a worldview that says we can't do this alone. In as much as they've tried to reroute us into individual things through what? Student loans, right? Through, really bad job prospects, right? Yeah, that's right. And that I think that there's a moment now where people can begin to identify what collectives they want to be part of and how they want to basically mobilize those collectives. The prospects are grim, right? One is that we have all these crises, right? One is a public health crisis, which is a direct result of capital accumulation strategies that have disrupted the ecosystem. And Anna can tell you about this, what Marx called the metabolic rift, and later Marxists have developed even more in terms of, if you screw with nature enough, if you treat it as an object totally, you're going to have pathogens enter into the systems of human beings and kill them, right? And that's what we're seeing now. And this is not going to be our last pandemic, by the way, just so you know that. I'm a medical anthropologist, by the way, by training. The other thing is the political crisis that's continuing amongst the elites in this country, which has ramifications for the lives of the poor and the lives of everyone in this country. At the heart of that political, crisis is the inability of those elites to reproduce themselves, right, as elites. The fact that Trump took over the Republican Party, that Bernie almost took over the Democratic Party, is a sign of motion on the right and on the left, but is a sign that the parties themselves are hollow. They're hollow, and they've been hollow for a long time. I mean, really, the last person with a program, maybe in the White House, was Richard Nixon, believe it or not. That was the last person with a program. And, you know, he was clearly had fascist tendencies, right? So when we think about the Democratic Party, the Clinton, Obama party, it's fairly empty of a program. Like if I would say to you, like, you know, what's the Democratic program? What are the Democrats going to do? Are they going to have national health insurance? Are they like, if I were an opportunist Democratic Party politician, right? I'd be like, student loans forgiven, national health care for everybody. That's what I would be doing. And they're so afraid of being associated with the squad, the left, that they won't even do that, you know? So that they're basically hoping that people will come out and vote for them simply because they're not Trump. And I think this time it's going to work, actually, right? But we'll see what the outcome is. So we have the political crisis, that's going to continue. We have the racial justice crisis. And because we have a paramilitary police state, basically, a paramilitary form of policing, that's going to continue, right? And then, of course, we have the economic crisis, which is the question of, there's a couple of things to think about here. Mature capitalist economies, and by that I mean Europe, I mean North America, and I mean East Asia, are in a form of secular stagnation, right? They have to struggle more to get returns on profit. What basically Marx talks about capital valorization, right? Basically extracting more surplus value from the laboring populations. So that's like a permanent condition, right? That's not going to change that often, that much, right? And that stagnation is also in dialogue with the metabolic rift and the climate change crisis that we're talking about. So all those crises are going to continue. So for us as activists, as organizers, as culture workers, as theater makers, right? All that is pedagogy. All that is popular education. All that is about how do you mobilize the affective, social, collective resources of people to embody, right, a new way of living, right? Where, you know, one of the French Marxists say, we have to develop the bodies that will allow us to be free for the new futures that we're looking at. But I would say right now, I think we're in an incredibly good position to do this kind of work, create theater, have study groups, organize. The generation of young people who have been radicalized by the Black Lives Matter movement, many of them white, are going to need formation, are going to need people to have conversations with that have been in struggle for a long time. I mean, like I said, I became a socialist when I was 18. You know, a lot of us have been around for a long time, and we made a lot of mistakes. You know, I mean, I admit that, you know, straight up. We haven't provided the kind of formation processes and structures that are needed for people to continue their activism and grow as people. So I think now this is an opportunity to try to begin to do that. At the heart of pedagogy, I think, is a desire for knowledge embedded in a practice of real love, not sentimental bullshit love, and in service of the development of communities of practical, moral reasoning, right, that allow us to discern the needs and desires of our times and to act on that in a collective way, right? A lot of American culture is psychologically framed. And in the end, that's individual, right? But I think if we can go to these traditions of pedagogy that are about this learning, the collective learning process, and yeah, bell hooks is a perfect example of that, actually. Michelle, we can move in a proper direction. I'm going to stop now and just have a conversation with y'all about some of this stuff. And also, just to wrap up is, think about it this way. What are the stories we need to tell? that are adequate to the times we're living in, that can give people an explanation of what's happening, right? And a narrative that is sober, that is grounded in reality, but is hopeful. I don't know if, like, I'm a radical Christian and Marx, right? I don't really care about optimism, pessimism, right? I basically sort of am into hope, right? Is there a hope? You know, and I remember a beautiful scene, a documentary on Bobby Castle, who was a radical priest in Harlem for many years. And he's talking to Jonathan Demme, I guess his cousin, and he says, Jonathan, I have a reasonable hope that I will see our relatives in the next life. And I said to I really was powerful, you know, because it was based in praxis, right? Based in praxis. So to finish off, I would say, let's think about all these things, engage these various things, give analysis, do the pedagogy, and remember that for me, right, as a member of faith communities, right, and someone who does spiritual direction for activists of color, I always go back to Ignacio Ellacuría, the Jesuit theologian, who said, what theology is simply reflection on the praxis of faith communities. And whether you believe in God or not, you have to have faith to engage in social struggle and to perdure in that faith. So one of the things I would say, or I would not challenge, but just accompany you in, you know, that we can accompany each other in, is this question of creating these communities where we have these, you know, if you will, reflection on praxis and seeing what the next step is. What is the coyuntura? And I think what we really need now, and I've been having conversations with the comrades from the Institute for Christian Socialism about this, we really need a collective revolutionary pastoral and theological strategy to engage what we're living through. And that's going to come out of community practice as well. I'm going to stop there and let's talk.
Thank you, Edgar.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And now, before we open it up to the chat, I just want to volley some questions so we start in the direction of the mission of the Theater of the Beloved Community, really what we can use theater for, and how to best, frankly, communize. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask is related to the compounded effects of colonialism and capitalism, is a focus on the date of October 12th. Now, October 12th is the actual date in 1492 when Columbus and his crew landed in the Americas, and the native people of the islands swam out to meet them. And coincidentally, October 12th is the day that Tatiana Jefferson was murdered in her home in 2019.
That's right.
And it's also the day that Matthew Shepard officially died in 1998. Now, when we think about the intersectionality of these tragedies, these points that permanently marked history, how do you think we could best synthesize them in a way that helps to instill our minds? I don't want to ask too much in one question, but how to best instill in our mind.
Just lay it on us. I don't have an answer any.
Specifically,
anyway, we'll talk to each other about it.
Good. Specifically in theater. So popular theater, revolutionary theater.
Right.
That really makes this consciousness of everything that's happening, and not simply some isolated focus on a white victim, for example.
Right.
to make sure that consciousness, that intersectional consciousness, is omnipresent.
Cool. That's cool. I'm not going to avoid your question, but I do want to have other people respond, and I'm gonna come. I'll let let's have people talk, but I just want to remind you of something that Amiri Baraka told me about theater, which I think might be helpful in terms of like bringing things together. But other people need to respond, because I am not the subject that, like Lacan, right? The subject who knows everything. I'm just I'm just in this process with you, more or less confused. But I do want to have this conversation around some of the stuff that you just brought up, which I think are quite apropos for theater. And all of you have a lot more experience in theater than I do.
So now if anybody has a question, they can raise their hand in the chat. And if you don't have the hand raising function, you can privately message Michelle to let her know that you have a question.
Come on, Michelle, you guys started the theater. Come on. Come on, Stephanie. You guys are theater people. Lay it on us.
You threw the question again.
It's for me, what I heard Dom say was like all these different aspects: the Colombian exchange, the brutality against Black folks, the brutality against out queer people. How do they connect, and how do you represent them to people in the theater, in a theatrical way, like especially in terms of popular theater? That's what I heard.
And I think do you want to broach the question, or?
Who, me?
Anna. Anna put her hand up. I just wanted to.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So, yeah, I was thinking about it in two respects. One was just, to comment on some of what our students, what they've been up to. And so not theater within the bounds of maybe a traditional theater program, but I guess I come at theater more, from a political sense. That's my background, really, in terms of rallies and vigils. And so our students, they had a Black Lives Matter vigil, and they had a series of demands that they're pursuing. One of which was to change the name of the powwow because it's named after a Dutch colonial settler, Powell, who was, kind of a leading member of the Dutch West India Company. And it's interesting because he had a patroon here, and I don't think he was ever here. And he had a patroon though in our area, like in near Paulus Hook, and he kind of reminds me of like Trump, because even that he blew. He couldn't even get the 50 members that he needed to. And yet this guy is venerated and honored. But what he's emblematic of and is white settler colonialism, which intends to eliminate and replace, right? The native peoples, eliminate and replace. So I always think it's kind of ironic when you hear the white nationalists today, you will not replace us, like you did to everybody else, or what, but also he was responsible for bringing the first slaves to New Jersey. And then of course, St. Peter's now names just about everything after this clown. So the students, that name is going to change. But what struck me is I've been listening to some of the names that folks have been suggesting, and one of them was like, was it chivalrous or something? I'm thinking like, are you kidding me? Like, So part of what I think so much of the work is that we don't even have the language for what we want, right? We don't even have the words. Amen. We can't say it, and we don't. So I think that so much of our work, as Edgar is saying, is in these smaller communities, and this work of desire, of imagination. I've been reading, Terry, who's on the call too, I shared Eddie Glaude's new book on Jimmy Baldwin, which I would highly recommend. I've been reading it with my social justice students. And he talks about the elsewhere, for Jimmy Baldwin, it was Istanbul, right? Where he could kind of collect himself in an environment that wasn't, so destructive as it was here. Now, of course, I wouldn't recommend going to Istanbul today, but nonetheless, the point is, where, as Edgar also said, where is that community of love of yours? Where can you be genuine? Where can you laugh with people? Where can you break bread with folks? But I think it's essential because so on the one hand, the students have done amazing work. And the way that we do theater is through rally and vigil. And it might be interesting to talk about why we need to do that. Why do bodies have to be out in public? Why don't we just sit at home, and do this alone or whatever? But there is something about the body in public that is so essential, so necessary. And then I'm thinking, as an educator, when I'm listening to the names that have been suggested or not suggested, I'm seeing we have a lot of work to do because we can't even name what we want to see. Now, my other experience, of course, comes, as Edgar mentioned, from the Kairos community, which, as I get older and older, very old in my life, I just am so grateful. God, that was such a grounding community with Father Dan Berrigan and so many others. Not so good, it's still basically an all-white community, so it has its failings in a major way there. But nonetheless, it was the same kind of thing. We did all these vigils and rallies and demos in New York, and there's a certain discipline to that. There's a certain way of being in the world, a certain way of walking, certain places that we went to and knelt and were rested together. It's always done in community, always. It's hard for me to think. That's why sometimes I find American culture so alien, because it's so fixated on individualism. I'm thinking, like, how can you operate like that? It's like community or bust. But for me, I'll just end here because I don't want to go on. People are like, we had this great conference until Anna Brown started talking. Finished until 3:15.
Ada, you are amongst comrades and friends.
Right.
You're amongst the lucky 7 here.
Shut up. But I will say this, that one of the things that Dan always liked to talk about with regard to Dr. King is that when folks in the South were organizing, they would come out of the church is where we came from, out of, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this, basically what he's saying is what Abe Correa is saying. Where is that spiritual depth that you're coming out of in community with others? Because you have to my mind, we got to start there. We have to come out from, and the classroom is the same thing. I was saying to Edgar, we were texting a couple of weeks ago, that discussion of a community of love that Glad was talking about, that is always the center of my class. It has to be that, even more so than the intellectual side, which of course obviously is hugely important, but it's where we come from. It's got to be that community of love. If it's not that, you're going to get this academic arrogance. You're going to get people who use their intelligence to design cages to hold immigrant children kidnapped from their mothers. No, that we can't be doing that. It's got to be from that, centered in that community of love, and everything flows from that. So.
Yeah, that's right on the money. And you're reminding me of, I was on a panel with 2 other queer of color intellectuals, activists really, and the first guy, Carlos de Senos, this wonderful Dominican queer man, said, it was at the Hedrick Martin Institute, which is the Institute for LGBTQ youth, social services. We're on a panel with them. My sister was working for them. And he just said, this institution right here is here because 2 people decided to love you. 2 people that you would never met, who you'd never meet, right? And I think that that's a piece of, it's almost, that idea that love is about the possibility of a future relationship with people you never even met, right? People you never met. In our tradition, it's right, the communion of saints, right? It's the host of witnesses, right? In Santeria, which is part of my tradition too, as a Puerto Rican, it's the Egun, the ancestors, who in the rituals, it's always, we begin the rituals with oblations to the ancestors because we know they're right behind us. They're right behind us, right? Literally.
So that's a really great segue, Professor Colon, into some of the
Edgar, Michelle.
And I still call.
You were never my student.
I still call. No, it's funny that I should be more comfortable saying your name because that's my dad's name, Edgar. So like,
there you go.
So the first thing that I think of was something that I was telling my friend earlier today in response to that issue with the Department of Labor and just like the lack of access since April, this failed filed claim. And I was having a physiological response. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. And you touched upon this about in your pedagogy, the student side of that approach to a classroom. And I experienced it in every Dr. Brown class, every Dr. Suri class, every class that had that approach, right? Where you weren't just presenting intellectual evidence for things or literature for explaining social conditions and social failings. You were also asking us to think about their implications in our own lives, to see it through our own lens. Even Dr. Suri, the Title V research, right? He started us off thinking about our first generation experience. And I didn't even think that I was, surpassing any kind of, what's the word? Expectations that have already been made for me socially because of being a child of migrants and what have you, right? So as I was listening to this person from the Department of Labor, run around and produce bureaucratic nonsense to not really explain or answer the question, I kept thinking about why I was having a physiological response. And I've come to terms, and even thinking back to my thesis presentation and to all of those classes, not having those words is also part of this physiological response where as a student, you're presented with this and your mind goes into eureka, right? And you're kind of like connecting the dots. You're sitting in that sociology class and watching Inside Job, and all of a sudden you're like, so my parents didn't just file for bankruptcy because they filed for bankruptcy. There's an entire institution who chose to, abuse people who didn't know any better, who are buying their houses for the first time, fulfilling an American dream, only to have it shattered because they didn't know that they were contributing to this bubble, right? I have a bone to pick with Alan Greenspan, but we're not going to go there. But I present that example.
Me too.
Present that example because the physiological response is it's hard. Like my hands start, I'm like shaking just talking about it. My speech gets faster. I'm like trying to, and then the interesting part, and it wasn't until today that I was like, oh my God, wait a second. It's like recognizing the injustice, but feeling like there's a deep fear that you now have to kind of like, shut up. I have to talk about this. I have to like address this. I have to speak out about this. And I can't tell you how hard it was to go to my first vigil at St. Peter's. Like organizing or activism or being a public body was not something that and people will be surprised to hear this. They think I'm very outspoken and or very social, but there's a huge part of me that took a lot of like, this fear can't keep you from saying things as you see them, especially when I am capable of seeing them, right? Like not everybody can read through someone's bureaucracy. Not everybody can read through someone's lies or, logic or even, the emotional cover up that they're creating to speak to us, but lie to us, right? Which is what happens with the elites, right? They pander to our emotions too. Like they're really good at it. So I just keep thinking about this physiological response. And Dr. Brown, you said this, like, we don't have the words. And sometimes you don't have the words because a lot of us are really walking around with generational trauma, like eating at us, right? Like I still feel as an Afro and Indigenous person coming to terms with this. It's just like, I feel the deep, like I can see the oppression too. Like if I find myself as an adult, not much older, I see my grandmother, who's really the Afro matriarch of my dad's side. I see it in her eyes. Like there's so much that she has had to endure. And now I can see it in other people around me my age, right? And it's like, well, when we're walking with all this generational trauma, it's no wonder we either don't have the right words, and then we're also under conditions that don't allow us to find the right words, right? Like all these distractions that we're around, right? Why aren't there more people having this conversation? Because this is not maybe as exciting as scrolling through my Instagram on Halloween. But I should be more inclined to learn about All Hallows Eve and its Celtic cultural traditions, even on a day like today, right? Having a conversation about something that would hopefully or could potentially culturally be important, right? But we don't. We have other distracting conversations. So of course we don't have the words. And then I think that's the beauty of theater, right? Because like I in high school tried out for West Side Story and then a play freshman year. And then I was like, I'm having way too much physiological responses saying somebody else's words, right? And I'm like trying to figure out why my emotions are coming off in somebody else's words. I'm like, this is not the right emotion for these words. So I was like, I'll just do Argus these 4 years. And I remember Rent so vividly my first year, but from backstage. And that's how I approached a lot of this. And I'm just kind of like, there's a lot to be learned about not only taking that backstage. And so the interesting thing about this community is that maybe we'll find some right words. Maybe we'll be able to kind of help each other as a community with physiological responses like this, especially if my peers are engaging in this, right? In this work and rereading words that aren't their own, but that have very much important significance, relevant experience today. And then maybe ultimately really like, I think, Don, what I keep thinking about is like the imagery of a protest happening on stage and coming out to the streets. I still remember that, right? Like, and that's how I imagine, like one day we all show up and we start like, everybody's in the streets. I mean, we've seen bits and pieces in Black Lives Matter, but I feel like if it happens inside the theater and we're physiologically capable of finding the words and finding the courage, we'll walk out like we really need to, right? Because I don't know how long before, the revolution really does look like every single person who sees and can really understand our social conditions right now and commandeers the United States. Like I have like dreams of this, right? Like every single person who is on our side, for lack of a better way of explaining that, really does put their body, especially white people, but everybody's body, not just my body as a person who identifies as socially and racially oppressed. Although I don't live in that truth either, which is crazy. Because I can't, because then I'm physiologically further feeding the fear versus like the courage I need, right? So anyway, yeah.
I think both you and Dom have hit on something really important. I think Anna also got it later. You gave it to us very well. There's an interesting word in psychoanalysis called extimacy, E-X-T-I-M-C, T-I-M-A-C, extimacy. And Lacan, and actually his son-in-law, uses it in a certain way. I didn't use it that way. Extimacy simply means this, and I think the theater brings this to us, and maybe this is a rather weak response to your strong question, Dom. Extimacy means that what is in our internal life can be encountered most deeply outside of us. And that's why we need community, right? That a lot of the individualism that we suffer from is a hollow interior that's not connected to that outside. And that's really what, in one sense, capitalism does with commodity culture. But extimacy is about the fact that, and this is like I don't know what to call it, a koan of some sort. Those things that are most me are outside of me, right? And I think that theater is able to like represent that in the assemblies that they have of people acting, right, and engaging on that level. So extimacy for me is the recognition that the individual unit will not save us, right? I mean, the one thing the pandemic has made clear is isolation is what this system is about, isolating people. And people are breaking through that isolation heroically, right, in very good ways, right? So I think that maybe the pedagogy that I find most compelling in theater or in political ritual, like a vigil, like a protest, right, like a rebellion, or just speaking at a council meeting saying, look, this is a scam. We know the real estate industry is behind this. What's really interesting or is this idea of externality, of understanding that what we consider the intimate and the individual is profoundly connected to what we consider the outside, right? And that's one of the paradoxes. Like I'm writing a book on political spirituality, and really, I think there's like this tradition, you know, that you can think about is this thing that we have between the individual and society. That stuff is made up. You have to create a whole social, educational, ideological apparatus to get people to think themselves as individual only, right? Right. That the sign that there's a whole social mechanism at play is when people say things like, "I'm a self-made person. Nobody ever gave me anything," you know, that kind of stuff. And you know that a lot of the American dream stuff is about that exceptionalism, right? And it's crap, and it's unhealthy. And if you're on a respirator, right, God forbid, and you have COVID-19, right, and the power grid goes out, believe me, you're not going to be talking about individualism. You're going to be like, how can we get to help this person? And so I think that one of the things I would say, and this is to a certain extent what we do in narrative medicine, my other life in narrative medicine, is that we get people into group, you know, processes to talk about what we call a third object, art or movie or whatever, and then to get into that process of conversation. I think what the theater does is it starts those conversations, and it's not like, you know, propositions. It's about, here's this body, these bodies assembled this way, and they're teaching us something, right? And it happens in between all those bodies. And I think Anna's quite right. There's something about the body in public that we need, or bodies in public that we need perceptually. And then in terms of feelings, like, think about this country. We've never had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
that transformative justice and accountability is something this country has never had to do.
Never.
They accepted their ignorance, and or still don't feel compelled, and or like they own that to anybody, right? The questions of reparations too. Like, if everyone knew what I've learned in Soul JC around this topic and of accountability, this whole country would be sitting down and, you know, obviously white patriarchy, male, basically sitting down and actually asking for forgiveness. If they even could begin to understand the ways in which they have destroyed justice, the ways they've literally diminished any kind. And then, you know, people have said this, like, you're lucky Black people aren't asking for vindication or revenge. They're just asking for equity, like a chance, right? If people of color, Black people, Indigenous people really wanted to, I mean, they probably could. Honestly, I wouldn't put it past us. We're really powerful people and we're not oppressed. But
praise God.
And then so the process of accountability, even like recognizing that I may not have been harmed directly, I may not have actually caused the harm, but I have accountability to the process of, you know, having the harm and the person who's been harmed at the seat at the table, right? Like in the TRCs of the Tutus and the what were they?
In Rwanda, in South Africa, right?
Yeah. Desmond Tutu.
In Northern Ireland, in Belfast.
That was all of my conflict resolution study. Most of it was just that, was like focusing on the imagination, right? That it took to really see that you as a person who causes harm need to hear from the person you've harmed, and you who's been harmed need to hear, like just that, right? But no one's ever bothered to hear us, and now they're gonna have to, right? Like, yeah. So anyways,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
But like, as you said that, I was like, yeah.
No, it's true. I mean, it's true, right? Like, and I'm going through. Ricardo Falla is a Jesuit anthropologist who spent many years amongst the Mayan population in Guatemala, and he just, in the last couple of years, he's published a 5-volume collection of his writings, many of which couldn't have been published when he was basically living amongst the Mayan people and collaborating with Ejército Guerrillero del Pobre, which was an armed group. And Ricardo talks about like the process of moving towards sort of the peace accords and stuff. But you have to, like, people have to say these crimes were committed. This is what we did. These are the victims of these crimes. You have to deal with that. And Trump, right? Trumpism is sort of almost an unconscious realization that these things have happened, and along with just a result of deindustrialization, right? The economic agency of the elites that run this country who don't give a shit about us. I mean, if you're willing to kill 200,000 people and let that machine go on, I don't know what else you need to know. I mean, that they will kill you if they have a chance, they'll kill you, right? So, as long as the donuts are being made, right? So I think that Trumpism is a realization. It's, first of all, I think economically a result of deindustrialization, right? When you get enough people who don't have a future, right? And a sort of unconscious piece that says this country will become majority non-white, and these folks will do to us what we did to them, right? And that's the fear, right? I actually think that's not the case, because I think there's something called revolutionary mercy that is true, and that I've seen. Simple example: Tomas Borge, one of the leaders of the Sandinista Front, when he confronted one of his torturers, said, "My revenge on you is I'm not going to put you in prison, and I'm not going to do anything about it. I know I got tortured and all that." And I think there are moments in human history where you can do that, where you can create that revolutionary mercy, right? And we're going to need a lot of that, obviously, which isn't blind. That's that ableist term, which isn't like unaware, which is not aware of the historical crimes, right? But part of it as well, as part of it in the sense of, look, this happened, this is what needs to happen. And I think, your generation, Michelle, Dominic, y'all got that. Mike Davis was on a panel, and he was like, my sons were like, "You're gonna vote for the Democrats? You really think that's gonna change it?" This is like a 17, 16-year-old son saying, "Yeah, right, Mike. Yeah, Dad, that's fine." And I think, what everybody think of voting is like when the young people are like, "Hold on, we have to change the whole thing. We got to get rid of the whole thing." That means that they're already at that level of consciousness, right? And we don't know what the long-term effects will be, right? In the sense that Talia Cuno from Cooperation Jackson said to us once, I remember in one of the videos actually he did, said, Katrina, the reason Katrina exists, or rather Black Lives Matter exists, is because of Katrina, the delayed reaction to Katrina, and the disappointments of the Obama regime. That Black folks said, hold on, you treated us like this under Bush, and then this guy comes up and he's an empty shirt. I mean, he's an empty suit. I mean, he's symbolically important, but he won't do anything. He won't do anything. He won't do anything that will create conflict outside of the healthcare piece, right? So I think that we're in that moment where there's all kinds of pivots happening, right? And I think we just need to be attentive, see what's happening, look at what's happening, see what our resources are, and in terms of pedagogy though, what a great time to start learning communities and be part of learning communities, and also to consider those questions that I started with. Who are your people? Who claims you? Who do you claim? What is yours to do? What is ours to do, right? And like a fundamental question that M. Adams from Minnesota always talks about, and will say, like, if you're not for your people, what are you for? What are you about, right? And Adams is really saying, you must claim and be claimed in love with others, right? Because you're not going to do this alone, right? And Adams is right, like whoever's running the government, they'll kill Black people or anybody else just as well as anybody else, right? So I think we have to keep on thinking about that. Now, the next week is going to be, I think, maybe difficult for people in terms of watching the news and all that other stuff. But, I think there's a piece where, like, for me at least, I go back to my old man, he used to say to us, "Oh, más se perdió en la guerra, mijo." We lost more in the war, right? And what he meant by that was simply that, we're Puerto Ricans, Jack. We got colonized by the Spanish. We got colonized by the Americans. It was illegal to fly a Puerto Rican flag in Puerto Rico. It's illegal to speak in Spanish in my father's little hillbilly high school in Puerto Rico. So they would put a kid at the door, and when the principal came, they would switch. The teachers would switch it to English. They had So they've done all kinds of and then throughout the 20th century, from the 1930s on, there were Puerto Ricans in federal prison for being nationalists, right? And so from my standpoint, we have to take a long view, right? This is a long struggle. Some of us come from people that have been in struggle for centuries, right? And I'll tell this story and end off, but when I was at Fordham, I got to know some of the folks up in the Irish section and some of the IRA people. And, and I remember having a conversation with George Harrison of happy memory, that Irish militant. And he said, I remember he saying to us once, he said, in his beautiful, brogue, he said, we've been fighting the British for 700 years. And then he would just look at us and sort of say, you know what our motto is? Our time will come. Right? Our time will come. So I always say, here's one of the longest anti-colonial struggles in the history of the Western world, the Irish struggle, right? And there's this guy, George, God love him, George Harrison. Never forget him. He showed up at every protest, and he would say to us, our time will come. So I think that's another piece to think about too. Not only that the work you're doing is important, that you've created something new that's attuned to the reality of what we're living in, and also that you have a long vision. Our time will come, and I'm going to stop there.
Do we have any other questions or concerns or responses, reactions before we start to close? Alrighty, so thank you, Edgar Rivera-Colon.
Yeah.
That sounded so weird. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to really engage with us. I know I always say I miss school, and so these moments for me are like really, really important. And I'm sure everyone here today has gotten even just a little bit of preparation for what will be a marathon week, a marathon month. So, I mean, I couldn't have imagined a better way to start November's marathon. Thank you again. Thank you everyone who came and shared in the space. Please look out for emails in the future. We hope to have these frequently, as frequent as possible. The revolution is coming. But thank you so much. All right, and enjoy the rest of your weekend and happy all.
Dia de los Muertos, and I'm gonna just to tell folks, I'm going to be after the election having I have these queer TO roundtables where we just get together and mostly we make jokes and do political analysis. So keep your eye out for after the election. We'll be having a queer TO roundtable where folks can just check in and talk and and see how they're feeling. So I'm going to be doing that after the election. So keep your eye out on Facebook, and all are welcome. All are welcome. All are welcome.
Social media pages for you too. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Edgar. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Anna. Good
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Mr. and Mrs. Mastrodonado. Bye-bye, Dominic. Thank you, Stephanie. God bless.
Thank you.
Keep me in your prayers, please.
I don't need 'em.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.